The air in your lungs feels like powdered glass, dry and freezing, scratching at your throat with every shallow breath. You can feel the skin on your knuckles cracking, the moisture being sucked out of your body by a wind that hasn't seen a rain cloud in 3 generations. Your stomach is a hollow, aching knot, a sensation that has become so permanent it's essentially a part of your personality now. Have you ever wondered why, despite being the most successful species on the planet, we are all so eerily similar to one another? Why is it that if you take 2 random humans from opposite sides of the globe, they are more genetically alike than 2 mountain gorillas living in the same patch of forest? What if I told you that every single person you've ever met, every historical figure you've studied, and every person currently breathing on this planet is a descendant of a group of people so small they could barely fill a few rows of a football stadium? And perhaps most importantly, how did those few hundred souls manage to stay alive for over 1,000 centuries when the entire world was actively trying to freeze and starve them out of existence? To understand how close we came to the end, we first have to look at the strange, quiet evidence hidden inside our own blood. If you look at most animal species, they have a massive amount of genetic diversity, a deep well of different traits and variations that act as a safety net against disease or environmental change. But humans are different. We are, genetically speaking, a bit of a bore, which, if we're being honest, is a pretty strange thing to say about a species that built the International Space Station. Our DNA looks like a document that was accidentally deleted and then painstakingly recreated from a single, slightly damaged backup file. Why are we like this? Why do we lack the genetic variety of our primate cousins? Could it be that we didn't just evolve into this state, but were crushed into it? This is the central mystery that led scientists to a realization that is as haunting as it is impressive. For a long time, researchers were baffled by a massive gap in the human fossil record, a period they often call the muddle in the middle. Between roughly 900,000 and 600,000 years ago, it's like the human story just stopped. We find plenty of tools and bones from before that time, and plenty from after, but for a huge stretch of prehistory, the trail goes cold. Where did everyone go? Did they stop leaving fossils, or did they simply stop existing? To answer that, a team of international scientists from China, Italy, and the United States decided to stop looking at the ground and start looking at the math. They developed a sophisticated new tool called FitCoal, which stands for Fast Infinitesimal Time Coalescent, and it allowed them to do something that sounds like science fiction. They used the genetic sequences of 3,154 modern humans to project the species backward in time, mapping out how the population grew and shrank over millions of years. But what they found wasn't a slow, steady climb. It was a cliff. Around 930,000 years ago, the human population didn't just dip, it plummeted. According to the study, led by researchers like Wangjie Hu and Haipeng Li of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, our ancestral population crashed by a staggering 98.7%. We went from a thriving, widespread species to a tiny, flickering flame of just 1,280 breeding individuals. Imagine that for a second. The entire future of the human race, every poem ever written, every war ever fought, every child ever born, depended on a group of people smaller than the student body of an average suburban high school. If a single bad flu had hit them, or if a single lightning strike had started a fire in the wrong valley, you wouldn't be here to listen to this. But the real question is, why did it happen? What was the global killer that nearly deleted us? The answer lies in a planet that was undergoing a violent, slow-motion transformation. This period coincides with what geologists call the mid-Pleistocene transition. Before this, the Earth's ice ages were relatively short and mild, occurring every 41,000 years or so. But something shifted. The cycles got longer, deeper, and much more brutal, stretching out to 100,000 years. This wasn't just about a bit of snow, it was a total ecological collapse. In Africa, the ancestral home of these early humans, the cooling of the planet meant that the rains simply stopped coming. The lush, green savannas that had provided food and water for our ancestors turned into vast, dust-choked deserts. The tubers they dug up withered, and the great herds of animals they hunted migrated away or died off. Our ancestors were caught in an environmental meat grinder, a situation that, quite frankly, would have made a modern survival expert lay down and give up in about 20 minutes. So, how do 1,200 people survive for 117,000 years in a world like that? Think about that time frame for a moment. 117,000 years. To put that in perspective, all of recorded human history, from the first clay tablets in Sumer to the smartphone in your pocket, is only about 5,000 years old. These people lived in a state of extreme, high-stakes endangerment for more than 20 times the length of all human civilization combined. They were the 1,200 for a duration that we can barely wrap our minds around. During this time, they weren't just surviving, they were being forged. This is the period where scientists believe the human brain began to change in ways that would eventually lead to us. But why did we get smarter instead of just going extinct? Was it the pressure itself that forced us to innovate, or was it just a stroke of incredible, statistical luck? And if they were so few, where exactly were they hiding? While the rest of the continent was turning into a wasteland, these survivors likely found refugia, small, isolated pockets of land where the microclimate was just stable enough to support life. Think of deep river canyons, hidden coastal valleys, or high-altitude plateaus that managed to catch just enough moisture to keep a few plants alive. But living in these pockets came with a massive risk. When you're isolated in a small group, inbreeding becomes a literal species killer. If you only have 1,200 people, the genetic typos that we all carry start to stack up. This is likely why we lost so much genetic diversity during this time. Those who couldn't handle the pressure, or those who carried disadvantageous traits, were simply pruned away by the cold logic of natural selection. It was a 100,000-year-long audition for the role of human, and the standards were impossibly high. But biology wasn't the only thing that changed. If you're one of only 1,200 people on Earth, your social structure has to become your strongest weapon. You can't afford to be a loner. This is the era where many anthropologists believe human empathy and cooperation were hardwired into our DNA. In a world where every single individual represents nearly 0.1% of the entire species, the loss of one person is a catastrophe. You have to care for the sick. You have to share your food. You have to protect the elders, because they are the only ones who remember where the hidden water hole was during the last great drought 50 years ago. It's a bit humbling to realize that our capacity for kindness wasn't just a moral choice. It was a desperate survival strategy. But if they were so good at surviving, why didn't their numbers start to grow sooner? What was keeping the population pinned at that 1,200 number for so long? The bottleneck lasted until about 813,000 years ago, and the end of it is just as mysterious as the beginning. Suddenly, the genetic data shows a massive explosion in numbers. The population began to climb, and it didn't stop. This expansion coincides with the appearance of Homo heidelbergensis, a species that many believe is the direct common ancestor of both modern humans and Neanderthals. It's possible that during the long, dark night of the bottleneck, these 1,200 survivors perfected new technologies. This might be when we truly mastered fire, not just as a lucky accident, but as a controlled, daily tool for cooking and warmth. Cooking food was a game changer. It allowed our ancestors to get more calories out of less food, which provided the energy needed to grow our massive, fuel-hungry brains. But does a bigger brain always mean a better chance at survival, or did it just make us more aware of how precarious our situation really was? Consider the sheer psychological weight of being part of that population. They had no idea they were the last ones. They didn't have maps or satellite images. For all they knew, the entire universe consisted of their small band and maybe one or two others they occasionally encountered at a distance. They lived, loved, and died in a world that felt infinite but was actually nearly empty. When we look at the stone tools from this era, the Acheulean hand axes, we see a startling level of consistency. They were making the same tools for hundreds of thousands of years. This suggests a culture that was incredibly conservative, where tradition and the old ways were the only things keeping them alive. You didn't experiment, because a failed experiment meant your entire lineage ended. Which, considering how much we value disruption today, is a pretty sharp reminder of how different our ancestors' priorities were. But what about the things we lost during this time? When a population crashes that hard, you don't just lose people, you lose information. Think of it like a library burning down, leaving only a few charred pages behind. There were likely dozens of other types of early humans living across Africa and Eurasia before the bottleneck. Different groups with different physical traits and perhaps even different ways of thinking. The bottleneck acted as a filter, allowing only one specific flavor of humanity to pass through. We are the descendants of the survivors, but we are also the products of a massive loss of potential. What would the world look like today if a different group of 1,200 had made it through instead? Would we be more aggressive? More peaceful? Would we even have the same capacity for language? This brings us to a fascinating question about the control of our own evolution. Did these 1,200 people know they were on the brink? Probably not. They were likely just focused on finding the next meal or staying warm. But their survival suggests something profound about the human spirit. It's easy to be successful when the world is green and the weather is good. It's another thing entirely to keep the spark of a species alive through 1,170 centuries of unrelenting hardship. This period of isolation is likely what allowed the human genome to clean itself up and specialize. It's where we developed the specific genetic markers that define us today, including, oddly enough, some of the genes that make us susceptible to certain diseases now, but were helpful for surviving starvation back then. And then the climate finally broke. Around 800,000 years ago, the extreme dry cycles began to ease. The rains returned to the African interior, and the barriers between those small pockets of survivors began to fall. As they moved out and met one another, the genetic pool began to mix and expand. This was the Great Thaw, the moment when humanity finally stepped out of the shadows and began its long march toward global dominance. They moved out of Africa, crossing into Europe and Asia, and every environment they encountered was easier than the one they had just left. They were like athletes who had spent their entire lives training at high altitude in the thin air of a mountain peak. Once they came down to the plains, they were unstoppable. But as they spread across the globe, did they carry the trauma of that ancient near extinction in their behavior? Some scientists argue that the bottleneck is why humans are so prone to tribalism and us versus them thinking. When you spend 100,000 years living in a tiny group where everyone is your close relative, anyone from outside is a potential threat to your limited resources. We are the children of survivors who had to be intensely protective of their own small circle. But on the flip side, that same pressure is what gave us our incredible capacity for loyalty and self-sacrifice. We are a walking paradox, a species capable of the most horrific violence against outsiders and the most beautiful tenderness toward insiders. And it all traces back to those 1,200 souls huddling together against the cold. If you think about it, our modern world is just a much louder version of that ancient campfire. But we have to be careful with the inevitability of our story. It's tempting to look back and say that we were destined to survive because we are so smart and adaptable. But the math tells a different story. If the mid-Pleistocene transition had lasted just a few thousand years longer, or if the droughts had been just a few degrees more intense, the human lineage would have reached a point of no return. We are a biological fluke. We are a statistical anomaly that somehow refused to stay dead. A thought that makes our current global squabbles look a bit like two fleas arguing over who owns the dog. We are the 0.01% of the 0.01%. How does this change how you look at the person sitting next to you on a bus, or the person you see on the news from a country halfway around the world? If you go back far enough, you aren't just related to them in a metaphorical sense. You are virtually their twin. We all carry the same set of emergency genes that were salvaged from the wreckage of the bottleneck. We are a species of cousins born from a tragedy that we can't even remember. And yet, despite being so close to the edge for so long, we have managed to populate every corner of this planet, from the frozen tundra to the middle of the ocean. We are a testament to the idea that a small group of dedicated people can, quite literally, change the world, because they already did. But as we look at our modern success, we have to ask, Are we entering another bottleneck? We face our own set of global challenges: climate change, resource depletion, the threat of new diseases. But this time, we aren't a group of 1,200. We are 8 billion. We have tools and knowledge that our ancestors couldn't have even dreamed of. But do we have the same social cohesion that kept them alive? Do we have the same understanding that every single life is an irreplaceable asset for the species? Which, given the way we often treat each other, is a question that doesn't have a very comforting answer. Our ancestors survived because they had no other choice. We have choices, which in some ways makes our situation even more dangerous. The discovery of this bottleneck has completely reshaped our understanding of human history. It tells us that we aren't just the winners of evolution, we are the lucky survivors of a massive accident. It reminds us that our dominance on this planet is a very recent and very fragile thing. For most of our history, we weren't the kings of the jungle. We were a tiny, endangered population of primates hiding in the cracks of a crumbling world. We spent more time being at risk than we have spent being in charge. That realization should change the way we think about our future. If we could survive 117,000 years with nothing but stone tools and each other, surely we can survive the challenges of the 21st century. But that's only if we remember the lesson that the bottleneck taught us, that survival isn't an individual achievement. It's a collective one. Think about the sheer number of near misses that had to go right for you to be here today. Every one of your ancestors in that 1,200-person group had to survive long enough to have a child. Every one of them had to find enough food, avoid every predator, and survive every winter. If any one of them had slipped on a rock or caught a fever before they passed on their genes, the chain would have been broken. You are the end result of an unbroken 900,000-year winning streak against the most impossible odds imaginable. We like to think of ourselves as the masters of the earth, the ones who decide the fate of all other species. But the reality is that we are just a few thousand years removed from being the ones whose fate was being decided by a few inches of rainfall. So, where do we go from here? Now that we know how fragile we really are, what do we do with that information? Do we use it to realize how silly our divisions really are? Do we use it to find a new sense of shared purpose? Or do we just go back to worrying about the things that don't actually matter in the long run? The story of the 1,200 isn't just a piece of trivia. It's a mirror. It shows us who we are when everything else is stripped away. It shows us that when the world gets cold and the food runs out, the only thing that really matters is the person standing next to you. The genetic scar we carry isn't a sign of weakness, it's a badge of honor. It's the proof that we can endure the unendurable. It's the proof that the human story is a story of resilience above all else. We were forged in the darkest, coldest corner of prehistory, and we came out stronger on the other side. But we should never forget that we are only here because 1,200 people refused to give up. They held on through the dust and the ice, through the hunger and the fear, so that one day, their descendants could look back and wonder how they did it. And maybe, in wondering, we can find a bit of that same strength in ourselves. Consider the fact that for nearly 1,300 centuries, the total sum of human knowledge, human feeling, and human hope was contained within a group of people who could all sit around a single large bonfire. Every dream they had, every fear they felt, it was all so small, so fragile. And yet it was enough. It was enough to build empires, to map the stars, and to eventually understand the very DNA that they were so desperately trying to pass on. We are the expansion of that tiny, flickering point of light. We are the roar that followed 100,000 years of silence. But as you go about your day, moving through a world of 8 billion people, try to remember the silence. Try to remember the feeling of the dry wind and the empty savanna. Because the most important thing to understand about being human isn't how far we've come, but how close we came to never starting at all. It's a realization that should stay with you every time you look in the mirror or look at a stranger across the street. You aren't just a person. You are a survivor of a 900,000-year-old catastrophe. And that's a responsibility as much as it is a miracle. We often talk about the success of the human race as if it were a foregone conclusion, a natural result of our intelligence or our tools. But the genetic evidence of the bottleneck tells a different, much more humbling story. It tells us that for a vast stretch of time, we were a failing species. We were a biological dead end that somehow found a way to turn back. We didn't survive because we were the strongest or the fastest. We survived because we were the most stubborn. We refused to go quiet into the night, even when the night lasted for over 100,000 years. And that brings us to the most uncomfortable truth of all, a reality that sits quietly beneath the surface of our modern comfort. If you were to take all the genetic diversity of the entire human race today, all 8 billion of us, and compare it to the diversity found in a single, small troop of chimpanzees in Central Africa, you would find that those chimps are more diverse than we are. We are, essentially, a planet of relatives who have forgotten our own family history. We are a massive, sprawling crowd of people who are all actually clones of a tiny group of survivors who nearly starved to death in a desert 1,000,000 years ago. You are not an individual who stands alone in history. You are a temporary vessel for a set of genetic instructions that was nearly deleted forever. If a single one of those 1,200 ancestors had succumbed to a common infection or a hungry predator on a Tuesday afternoon in the year 850,000 BCE, your entire existence would have been erased before it even began. Every thought you've ever had and every person you have ever loved is a statistical impossibility that only exists because a few starving primates refused to die in the cold. We are not the masters of our destiny, we are the lucky remains of a species that almost didn't make it, and the only thing standing between us and total silence was a few extra drops of rain that our ancestors didn't even know were coming.